and so I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a New Yorker. I talk pretty fast, so I hope everybody's caffeinated, awake, and ready. And I think the temperature came down a little bit, so hopefully no one's fallen asleep. So let's get started. We live on an urban planet. We've become an urban species. The way we build, develop, plan, and govern our cities is impacting the entire planet in countless ways. And I want to discuss a number of these with you to sort of set up, hopefully, a number of conversations that are important for us to be having this week. Our cities are complex, they're connected globally, they're contested spaces, and they're congested spaces, and likely to get more so in the coming years. For example, 1.4 million people are being added to urban areas every single week. This is a city the size of Stockholm every single week being added to the planet. Our cities are engines of national and global growth. About 80% of global economic output is all coming from cities. If we just take the example of China, 4 urban city clusters in China account for 50% of that GDP. And this economic output is driving global consumption patterns. So part of what we're showing here in terms of these relationships of recent change in urban development and global environmental change that's coincident with that, I think is one of the most important drivers that we're seeing right now. Cities are key drivers of global growth. For example, global energy demand. About 70% of global energy demand is in cities. About 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are in cities. Accelerating urban development is boosting private consumption, requiring significant resources, including carbon-intensive manufacturing and construction. And these consume massive quantities of concrete, for example, and steel, especially in the early phases of urbanization. Meanwhile, urban land area, up here on the right, could triple between 2000 and 2030. This means adding an area larger than Manhattan to urban areas around the world every single day. Just watch the top bar up here in this panel in particular. This is 1950 and cities around the world. From 1950 to 2010, the global urban economy triples. And in just 20 years, it's likely to triple again. And at the same time, going from less than 1 billion urban residents to 5 billion urban residents. If we look at past and future urbanization trends, it's clear that not only urbanization, but the impacts that we're having are accelerating these pathways towards solidifying cities as the dominant drivers of global environmental change. I think one of the things that hopefully we're all paying attention to right now is the UNFCCC meetings at COP24. And one thing I noticed last week is that the Global Carbon Project showed that carbon emissions are up 2.3%. Now, basically what that's telling us is that we are not on those optimistic pathways that we might have in mind in terms of different projections based on the 1.5 degree goals of the IPCC and the Paris Agreement, or even on track to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So what I want to discuss with you for the next 20 minutes or so is what do we need to consider? What are some of the key considerations for transforming towards both sustainability and resilience? And we have to ask ourselves as well, and this is something Adriana is going to get into a little bit more after my talk, is sustainability and resilience for whom? Most of our cities don't look like this. In fact, most of our cities are more like this. They're full of informal settlements and run on an informal economy. Perhaps one of our greatest challenges is understanding how to support and enable diverse groups of people to make decisions for their families, for their neighborhoods, about their lives that support resilience at that scale, but also resilience at the city and regional scales. These and other considerations are part of a recent volume that I hope you'll get the chance to take out. It's free and available for download from Cambridge University Press called Urban Planet. And there's over 100 artists, thinkers, scholars of various kinds, designers and planners, all come together to discuss the nature of the urban planet now and ideas for how we transform. So I think it's a useful resource. Let's talk about another planetary change, not just urbanization, but climate change. I think Esteban's comments earlier from you in Habitat are right on point. This is something I want to spend a little bit of time on. IPCC projections, if you look at them, show that if we don't have a dramatic increase in transitions to renewable fuels, in decarbonizing the entire economy, and decreasing our consumption patterns, we're likely to face a future that's radically different from the one that we've experienced growing up or that our parents have. And I think about this when we talk about long-term futures. I really question the word long-term. I have 2 daughters, 7 and 10 years old. I hope they have healthy lives. If they have healthy lives, this 2080, 2100 that we've been calling long-term is not my great-grandkids, it's my children who are alive now. That future is actually very close. And so when we're thinking about the 1.5 degree of the Paris Agreement and this leveling off, potentially, of climate change, we have to ask ourselves, are we on that pathway? And if we're not, how do we achieve much more transformative pathways to get on a leveling off at the 1.5 degree? For example, in the discussions that have been going on last week and this week as part of COP24, one of the things that the Climate Action Tracker, just in a useful resource, if you haven't seen this, has noticed, is that the current pledges from all national pledges to meet the Paris Agreement don't get us to 2 degrees. They barely get us to a 3-degree future. So there's a massive amount of change that we have to do in order to get down to a pathway that's consistent with the Paris Agreement. And yet, I think one of the most important points that I want to make is that this is not some far-off future. This is already happening right now. And the potential impacts of shifting from, say, 1.5 to a 2-degree future have social cost, economic cost, ecological cost. Just even that one shift from 1.5 to 2 degrees is massive. Every half a degree matters. So when we're talking about resilience, we also have to be talking about transformation. When I say events are happening right now, let's look, for example, at extreme events around the world. One of the things that we're finding very clearly is that the number of natural disasters is going up very consistently, and it's coincident with the rise of urbanization and changing climate on the planet. And there's a reason for that. This is pretty well documented in the literature. The concentration of people and resources in cities is exactly what's driving increased risk to natural disasters. At the same time that consumption and the patterns that cities have on the planet is driving climate change to then drive those disasters, right? So this uncoupling and of urban and climate change and the kinds of impacts we see is something we have to dig into. I'm going to spend a few examples of talking about this, my town, New York City. This is the one I know the best, so I'm going to use a few examples from there just as maybe some ideas of what's happening on the planet. We've just completed a recent analysis of all natural disasters over the last 140 years and their impacts. And one of the things we see is that the economic costs are going up, again, because over time, more and more natural assets, infrastructure assets, and people are concentrated in these areas that are being impacted, in this case in New York City. Extreme heat and flooding here on the left, heat and flooding over here. These are the 2 most impactful events in terms of infrastructure impacts and economic impacts. And so New York City is very concerned about flooding. Since Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012, which really devastated the city in a way that at least in our lifetimes we haven't seen at that scale, that has mobilized the city to develop the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resilience, to launch a massive investment in terms of building resilience, in particular to coastal flooding. We're also worried about not just coastal flooding and storm surge, but extreme precipitation, like the hurricane that hit Houston, Texas, and dropped over 1 meter of rain in just a couple days. So these are things that the city's actively working on. And yet, if we think about people and the people that are affected, nothing causes more damage in terms of people's lives, in terms of mortality, for example, than heat. Heat is the #1 killer in New York City over the past 140 years. This is true at the national scale as well. We've seen recent reports in Europe similarly so. So there's a question about what we're building resilience to. Is it for our economy? Is it for buildings and roads? Or is it for people and people's lives? And these are things that often are trade-offs, and we need to figure out how we synergize those resilience efforts. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about heat. Heat waves are going up. Again, looking at New York is just an example of the kind of heat impacts that we're seeing, which is why we're working with the mayor's office there. We helped write this report that was launched last year, a $100 million effort to decrease heat and heat risk in the city. And yet this is just a drop in the bucket if we get serious about the kinds of potential pathways we're actually on in terms of heat and heat risk impacts in cities. For example, the New York City panel on climate change has not only said that heat waves are likely to triple by the end of the century, if not before, but also that potential mass mortality events are likely and getting into very likely phases. And again, this is sort of middle pathway projections, not the more extreme business as usual pathways, and not even the upper level of those pathways. This is based on a midpoint between RCP 8.5 and 4.5 projections. In the Urban Systems Lab, this is work in progress, but some of the work we've been doing is to model future heat based on IPCC projections at very high spatial resolution so that we can think about how do we improve planning to reduce risk, in this case reducing risk to heat, in the areas where that heat is most likely. Now, in the very short-term present, we can think about where are the areas where elderly people are living who may be most at risk to heat or other kinds of indicators, and where are some of the areas in the city that also are experiencing high heat, for example, here in red. Now, when you model out the future, that changes pretty dramatically, such that by 2080, and again, this is also a middle path projection here, but we're looking at increases where all across the city, an average summer day is like a heat wave today. Now, again, these are moderate projections. If we just take the upper boundary of those moderate projections, that temperature changes very dramatically, so that on average there's a 4.5 degree increase by 2080, or even up to 6.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. But if you notice the color in the maps, what you're actually seeing down here, and I know this is hard to see in the back, is that an average summer day, if we don't move to a 2-degree world or a 1.5 degree world, if that is moving towards 3 or 4 degrees, we're talking about a doubling of that in cities. And that means an average summer day is going to be 40 degrees Celsius and potentially up to 50 degrees Celsius. That's not a heat wave. So I only bring this, and not to scare us, but rather to say that I think if we're going to be talking about resilience, we need to get realistic about the kinds of challenges we face. And the other thing to say is this doesn't have to be our future. These are just projections, these are just scenarios, but they're important to sort of set a context, I think. Some of the work we've been doing with NASA has been to model future heat and future precipitation in cities all around the world, and the only thing you need to see here is the black bars. And the only point I want to make is that for all 40 cities, large, medium, and small cities around the world, there are no exceptions with rising heat. Every single city, when you model it out, is going to get hotter, and on average, about double the global mean rate. So cities are getting hotter and hotter much faster. Now, I mentioned these were somewhat optimistic pathways, in some cases more pessimistic in others. One of the things that we're really trying to understand here is that these are just underlying challenges to sort of set the frame, I hope, for what we need to build resilience to, and resilience for people as well as infrastructure and other components of our cities. And here, when we're thinking about human health, this is one of the major concerns, is really understanding how we're going to be building resilience so that people are less affected. And of course, it's not just about heat. I take a deep dive into heat just for a few minutes to kind of think about what are the details a little bit that we need to start digging into these trade-offs. Of course, it's also about fires. Fires in all around the world are of concern. It's about major storms like the one that hit our friends in Puerto Rico last year, Hurricane Maria, devastating to this island. And yet, in certain areas of the world, for example, here on the Hurricane Highway in the Caribbean, these cities, and not just the cities, but the cities and the urban and rural areas around them are under immense pressure to build multiple kinds of resilience to the kinds of climate-driven challenges that they're facing. And this driven a lot by sea level rise and warmer oceans. So I think we can say without hyperbole that we are on a collision course between rapid urbanization on the planet and rapid changes in the climate on the planet. The question really is here, what kind of city do we want to live in as an urban species? And how do we transition to a future that's both more sustainable and resilient? And the first point I want to make about that, and this is what I'm going to dig into a little bit, is that we need positive visions. So what I've presented are not very positive. On the other hand, they're just scenarios, right? We need alternative visions, visions that help us move from the current future to possible futures, and ones that aren't in that business as usual kinds of pathways, but actually are ones where they're more resilient and more sustainable. And there's many pathways to these future. And this also gives us the opportunity to think about whose voices are we hearing, who is included in the kinds of pathways that we're imagining to a more resilient future. And there's going to be unintended consequences. There's going to be certain kinds of path dependencies or lock-ins that we have to find a way to break out of, as well as a sort of pluralism of opportunities in terms of how we move from here to there. I think one issue that's overlooked, not just in visioning processes, but in urban policy and planning work, as Lorenzo mentioned in our scholarly work, is the conflating of sustainability and resilience as if they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. They tend to be poorly defined. They tend to be used interchangeably, and I'll just mention the SDGs. I'll mention the New Urban Habitat. I'll mention almost every one, and please tell me where you see exceptions to this, because I'm very interested, of our city plans, of the policies that were being made. They're sort of both put together as if they're somehow the same thing. If we think about where these came from, sustainability is really a normative goal of society, right? These are our articulation of goals and strategies that we want to happen to improve a better world. Now, resilience has taken on these normative dimensions. Now we have resilience goals and resilience targets. But the thing about resilience is that it's actually a characteristic of a complex system. It's something in theory we could measure, even though that's actually very difficult. But it comes out of more complex system dynamics. So I'm going to give you some examples of this. I want to dig into this a bit to explain how they differ and to say that, yes, they're complementary, but we need to get specificity and clarity and, again, bring in transformational thinking to really think about how we operationalize both resilience and sustainability in the actions that we're making on the ground. So this is work in progress, so I hesitate to present it, except I like to talk about it, so we're doing it. And it's built on the backs of lots of other brilliant thinkers, including Thomas Elmquist, Nikki Franziskaki, Eric Anderson, who's here, Carl Folke, one of the architects of resilience theory from the beginning, Per Olsen, who's really important in the transformations literature, and Owen Gaffney and Kazuhiko Takuchi. So just to acknowledge some of the other thinkers behind this, if we look on an axis of less sustainability to more sustainable, and less resilient to more resilient, one of the hallmarks of sustainability is efficiency. More efficient communication systems, more efficient transportation systems and transportation networks, more efficient energy use and the way we use energy, right? And yet, a focus on efficiency is to some extent directly at odds with resiliency. In resiliency, a hallmark of resiliency is redundancy and backup systems. One of the challenges that we face in cities around the world, when the power goes down, there's not a backup source, and things sort of cascade from there, right? You need backup systems. You need redundancy in your systems. That's exactly not what we're doing in sustainability when we're focused on efficiency. If you think about how this works from a network perspective, generally, our cities, and all of you are urban scholars, that complexity of the system is something that arises out of a more sort of organic and self-organized process that actually delivers interesting patterns, some of which we don't want, some of which we do in terms of the nature of that urban complexity. When we design a system and we design it efficiently, we're not designing for and allowing for self-organization, we're designing for low redundancy. Again, just highlighting this contrast between the need for redundancy to be resilient and the lack of redundancy if we're going to be meeting some of these sustainability goals. And this potential conflict, or actual conflict in some cases, I think is something we have to really wrestle with and untangle if we're going to be able to make transformations that achieve both resilience and sustainability. Our cities can be more resilient, more efficient, but at the same time, and I'm just going to underline this, and I know I'm repeating, but the concentration of people and infrastructure in cities is the way that we build that energy efficiency, right? I mean, this is one of the sort of fundamental tenets of why cities are so sustainable. And yet, these are exactly the reasons why we increase vulnerability and we increase risk to climate-driven extreme events. So at some level, there's a level of densification that we have to push back against and find somehow a sweet spot between these two. Let's dig into this a little bit further. Imagine here that we have a pathway from the present to the future, and that there's many pathways. So we just put a couple here, right? Ones that are lower sustainability pathways, not necessarily achieving the goals that we want, and ones that are much higher, right? Now, the orange around these blue lines is the resilience of the system. It's the property of the system, right? In some cases, we may have high resilience, where the bars essentially around these are wide, or we may have very low resilience in the system. Now, the reason for pointing this out is that we can think about how we can harness resilience to stay on a particular pathway. If that system that we're studying is resilient, it should maintain its current pathway. If it's not resilient, and in some cases we may want it, as Lorenzo was suggesting, not to be resilient, because we're not on the pathway we want to be on. If we need to make an abrupt transformation from, say, a current climate pathway that we're on to one that's much more transformative and that's bringing down ultimately the total temperature rise on the planet, we need to allow for more abrupt transformations, for really radical departures from the status quo, as my colleague David Owaniak likes to say. To do that actually means we need certain parts of the system to decrease in resilience. And I'll use maybe an easy example to think about. The politics in the United States. It's very resilient. It makes it, I guess you're following the COP24 right now, not accepting the 1.5 degree report. It's a very resilient system. For us to transform at the level that we need to, that we already have the skills and technology to do, requires breaking down that kind of resilience. You can think of other examples as well. So in the end, undesired resilience can conflict with a lot of our normative goals. And yet there's other kinds of resilience that are more desirable, getting into some of these normative dimensions that are being imposed on resilience. And we can harness those to shift towards more sustainable trajectories. But again, we need to really bring the transformations lens in here in order to do that. There's a couple different kinds of trade-offs, and I think one of these is understanding the trade-offs between sustainability and resilience, but it's also to understand trade-offs within resilience. For example, spatial trade-offs. We can imagine, and this is actually happening, where we're building resilience in one location while eroding it in another. And I'll pick on New York City again. Since Hurricane Sandy, we have a massive effort to fortify Lower Manhattan. Why are we doing that? Because Wall Street shut down during Hurricane Sandy, the economic impact spread all around the world from that. It makes a lot of sense to build resilience into our economy and protect Wall Street. It makes a lot of sense to build resilience into that infrastructure, and yet when the next storm comes, the water has to go somewhere. So are we also eroding resilience, social and infrastructural resilience in New Jersey and in Long Island or Brooklyn, for example? That location matters a lot. Also, we need to think about different kinds of resilience: social resilience, ecological resilience, technological and infrastructure resilience. So if we're managing for ecological resilience, this might be about promoting biodiversity and connectivity between our green patches, and yet that may or may not impact social resilience. This is something actually we need to understand, is the relationships between that two. We can also think about infrastructure or technological resilience, where we might design and plan for infrastructure resilience, and at the same time, those investments might be driving and reinforcing inequities and social injustices. For example, coming back to sustainability, normative goals for sustainability might be met through urban greening and nature-based solutions and bringing sustainable design and architecture together. And yet those might also be exactly what drives gentrification, displacing minority and low-income residents, the kinds of things that disrupt social networks, disrupt social cohesion, which are the hallmarks of community resilience. So again, these tensions are non-trivial, right? So I think the scholarly community needs to get it right. The practice community needs to get it right. And I'm just going to sum up this section of the talk and say that we need to be clear about the differences and not conflate them and not use them as if they're somehow the same thing, these two terms. There are trade-offs, and if we can understand the trade-offs, then we should be able to minimize the trade-offs. At least that's the hope and the positive message there. I think we need that clarity, we need to understand those trade-offs, and then, and this is the things I want to get into next, we need to really bring in this systems approach, which a number of people already highlighted, about how we bring systems thinking more directly into the way in which we plan for resilience or design for resilience, or work with communities to advance resilience goals. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I would say here's a few ways that we need to do that. One is to bring in this complexity, to really understand that we're dealing with complex systems. Another is to integrate novel sources of data. We're in the middle of an eruption of new kinds of data sources to better understand that complexity. We need to take advantage of new tools, advancing modeling, advancing new analytical tools, artificial intelligence and machine learning, also to communicate our science better, new data visualization tools, and to build decision support tools for the many layers of decision makers, from communities to cities to regional and national governments. And in all of that, to focus also on, again, things that Adriana is going to cover, on including different voices in that process and articulating the goals that we have, that is a more diverse and inclusive process. Picking up where Lorenzo left off, we have had two communities that I think have created an interdisciplinary approach that have brought systems thinking in for the last couple of decades, and they've been very successful. But they've also been very siloed and have become disciplines in and of themselves, and we're going to have to be more inclusive. And I think that comes from this complexity perspective, is to understand the nature of the complexity in the system. It means joining these together and not allowing them to be separate anymore. And one way to do that is to start thinking about our urban systems from a more inclusive lens, from ones that's social, ecological, and technological systems. And this social, ecological, technological systems approach is one that we've been employing in the Urban Resilience to Extremes project in US and Latin America. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning at 11:30 in room 303. But the point here is that if you take this lens, it forces us to think about infrastructure and technological resilience and social community resilience and ecosystem resilience together, and as well the way in which they interact. Just bringing data streams together can be powerful. Here, for example, if we're thinking about where do we put new green infrastructure to reduce temperatures and decrease heat risk, who are most vulnerable? Just combining the infrastructure information with information about the city. Here in green is income levels in Manhattan. In the purple is elderly. It's important for us to know where more at risk people are to heat, and the different ethnic and social groups. Or someone mentioned multi-hazard risk. In blue is coastal flooding, in orange is heat. We need to be able to start to bring these high-resolution spatial data to advance our planning now. That's the short-term kinds of work, as well as how we can start to use that as a way to model longer-term futures. We're in the middle of a data revolution, and I think this is worth underlining. It's why I put it in here, of moving from remote sensing and mobile technologies to social media data and the Internet of Things. The scholarly community tends to be well behind the private sector. And yet, at the same time, we need to be catching up to that in terms of the way in which we mobilize new data streams to understand this complexity. Because it's true, cities are very complex. They're not so easy to understand. There's many different disciplinary perspectives that we can come at it, and yet now there's also many types of data that I think are important. Social media, just as an example of this, is allowing us to ask questions we've never been able to ask before and get answers to. It's also allowing to ask at a scale and at a level of resolution we haven't had before, so we can start to better understand people's perceptions and attitudes and beliefs and what they value. Some people have said that in New York City there are 700 different languages spoken, the most languages in one location in any area of the world. How do we plan for resilience when people have different goals and different values? We have to understand those much better and at a granular scale, and there's tools for that that are going to help us. They're not silver bullets, they don't solve everything, but they're useful. The global urban community has been calling for a new global urban sustainability science. These messages have been out here for the last couple years, and I think the quantitative foundation for that is a critical one. And new data streams are not necessarily at the same level in different cities around the world, but they're coming online both in the global north and the global south. And I'll just mention this paper by Felix Kreuze et al., which is an outcome of the city's IPCC conference that lays out a whole series of different data streams and how we can start to use those to build that global urban science. That should be any day now in global sustainability. The other thing we're doing is bringing artificial intelligence and machine learning together. Some of the work we've been doing in the Urban Systems Lab has been to build a machine learning environment to understand, if we bring multiple of these kinds of data streams together, what have the changes been over the recent history, and how can we use that as a baseline for plausibility of examining when we bring in a future vision, whether it's likely to be plausible, moving from our current state to this more transformative state, and how do we move from here to there, linking qualitative information about people's visions with the quantitative information about the current status of our city as it is. For example, one of the ways we've been doing this is we bring a machine learning land use, land cover change model together with models about urban heat, like the ones I showed you earlier, and urban flooding, and population and social demographic projection models, to slowly build up a more complex submodel by submodel by submodel model of our urban systems, where we can start to examine those interactions. Now, this isn't easy, it's a little bit insane in some ways, but it wouldn't be possible without those kinds of data streams, or without the advances in computation that we have now. And so I'm just suggesting that there is a new era, especially for young scholars, to really start to bring computer science into this, to bring new APIs to access new data into the way in which we understand our futures from a more quantitative perspective. And yet the qualitative perspective matters too. Again, I was mentioning the importance of positive visions. Right? Some of the work we're doing, and this is the work we're going to talk about tomorrow in the 11:30 session, is the way in which we've been working with our collaborators, digging in deeply here in Harlem or in San Juan, Puerto Rico, or in Hermosillo, Mexico, to understand from a diverse group of stakeholders what are their visions for the future, what do they want to accomplish, bringing those visions in a qualitative way into a quantitative environment so we can start to then stress test those and ask, you have resilience goals, you have sustainability goals, where are the trade-offs when we start to look at it analytically as well? And can we identify those and find the synergies among competing visions to bring that into the planning process and the design process? And the reason for that is that, again, coming back to this dystopian future that sort of dominates the narrative around our futures, is what I was presenting earlier, that doesn't define our future. What we need is more positive visions, positive narratives, and ways to think about the future that are much more positive and counter this dystopian narrative that we have. So the last point I want to make is about the role of nature-based solutions. I'd say that 2018 marks a really interesting point in nature-based solutions going mainstream. And the reason I mention them is because I think this is one of the examples of a win-win for resilience and sustainability. A lot of the work around the way in which we bring urban nature as a solution strategy is taking off, and for good reason. It's because it's so multifunctional, right? There's so many co-benefits with this. The city's IPCC conference, which ironically was held in Edmonton, Canada, where the sites of the tar sands are busy ripping up ecosystems for more fossil fuels, is also the place where the IPCC first really brought together, from their network perspective, to think about the combined challenges of urbanization and climate change. And one of the top 4 highlights that came out of there for strategies was the role of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. Similarly, at the ICLEI meeting, which happened just a month after that in Montreal, it seemed to me anyway that nature-based solutions was kind of the main topic of that World Congress. At the high-level political forum at the UN in New York, at the same time last spring, again, here we were reviewing the SDGs and SDG 11, the urban SDG, nature-based solutions came up there again. And just last week, as part of COP24, the UNCBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, tweeted this: the nature-based solutions may be 30% of our climate solution. Now, I don't know if that's exactly the right number, but I do know that there's something happening right now. There's a momentum building around the role of nature as one of the tools in our toolbox for meeting both resilience challenges and sustainable development challenges. And there's a number of resources out there. I'll just point you to some work of colleagues in Europe who've been working on this, and also to keep your eye out for a January, hopefully January publication in Nature Sustainability, where we say, actually, there's still a lot of work to do there. There's still a lot of unknowns about nature-based solutions. We also need a systems perspective there that brings in the social, ecological, and technical infrastructure components to that. And one other sort of piece to that I think is really important when we're thinking about resilience is we've done so little work on ecosystem resilience. If we're going to rely on nature as a source of resilience, that nature itself has to be resilient. How do we figure that out as well so that we're also managing our ecosystems so they're resilient? We have a ways to go. If you look at change in just megacities, of the global biodiversity hotspots in blue here over time, one of the things that you can see is that every single global biodiversity hotspot is going to have a megacity in it. And that's just megacities. All nature on the planet is going to be affected by cities. And so how we manage and plan the nature in our cities is going to affect biodiversity around the world, and that, of course, is going to feed back to the climate impacts that we have to worry about for resilience. And yet, we're making a lot of progress. The SDGs are an important, I think, statement of where we are in terms of potential progress on the planet. The new urban agenda, the fact that cities are the locus for most of the sustainability action is really immense. And the other thing I would just personally excited about, maybe this is because I'm an ecologist, is all the tree planting that's going on. I mean, just as an example, it's amazing the billions of trees that people are mobilizing to plant as a nature-based solution for a number of our challenges. And it's a source of hope, and I think it's also a marker of why some of what we're talking about in terms of these sort of dystopian pathways do not have to be our pathway to the future, and that we can transform, more radically transform, towards resilience and sustainability. So I'm going to conclude, urbanization and climate change are already colliding. Extreme events are going to cause the most social infrastructure and economic impact in our cities. We need urban resilience, absolutely, but we've got to harmonize with the SDGs and other sustainability normative targets. Adaptation and resilience is key, but it's going to require transformation. Some of the pathways we're on are not the pathways we want to be on. We have to transform, we have to be more radical in order to achieve some of the goals that we have. We're going to need a better understanding of the trade-offs between resilience and sustainability. I think nature-based solutions are one of the examples of the way in which we can have win-wins between these two, and yet there's a lot of tools we haven't taken advantage of, from advanced analysis and modeling to new kinds of data streams that we can mobilize. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank a number of brilliant thinkers that some of the work I presented has relied on. This is certainly not my own work. And I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Timon. So the idea is not taking time for question now, but just split and go to the second speaker and then have the deserved time for a proper discussion. And so just welcome Adriana Allen, which is Professor of Development Planning and Urban Sustainability at the Ballet Development Planning Unit, DPU, University College of London. We'll be presenting a keynote on urban resilience or resilience justice, trajectories, politics, and outcomes across the urban global south. The PowerPoint is here.
Sorry? No?
No.
¿Bien? ¿Cuál es ese? Ah, lo van a hacer, ok, de acuerdo. ¿Pero este funciona o no? Lo van a hacer, ok. Good morning, everybody. Difficult to see. I should have worn my sunglasses. So I cannot see, but I'm sure everybody is awake, even at the back of the building. Like Timon, I am not from New York, but I also have the habit of speaking quite fast, like many Argentinians. So apologies if I do that. I will try to tame my enthusiasm as we speak. So many thanks to Timon for such a fantastic and comprehensive overview of where we are and what the resilience, urban resilience and its implementation entails, and also for Lorenzo and the rest of the team for organizing this fantastic and timely conference and for the invitation to have this space to talk to you. So, in a way, I think that there was some anticipation of what I might be putting on the table, and Timon mentioned that, oops, I want to go back, that's fine. Simon mentioned that I might be bringing questions of resilience for whom. And that's part of the equation, but perhaps most importantly, what I want to put on the table is resilience by whom. And by this, and before we start going, I mean, and in a way you can take this as the main contention that I would like to put on the floor for debate, is that advancing urban resilience requires an active acknowledgement, but also engagement with the multiple molecular resilience-seeking practices of, of ordinary women and men that in fact make cities, run cities, govern cities, sustain, repair, and so on. I go back, if you want, somehow, if you look at this first image, I try to represent that molecular structure. What I'm saying, in other words, is that when we talk about implementing urban resilience, we are not operating in a vacuum. Cities are made of resilience-seeking strategies and practices. And most significantly, cities are made by strategies and practices that are performed by ordinary citizens, whether collectively or individually, sometimes with positive and sometimes with negative outcomes. But we cannot ignore those practices. So before, the images that we see here are showing the context of Lima, a city where I had the opportunity to work for many years, and I will be referring and building the point that I have just made in light of the work and some of the discoveries that the work in Lima offered to us. Just remember, Lima is perhaps a good example. It's not the only example, but it's a good example of the type of challenges we're facing. Second, the largest metropolis in a desert area in the whole world, with huge levels of inequality, very fast conditions of urban growth, both demographically and spatially, and we could keep on going on about those conditions. But, is that? Next, please. No? Shall we? Ah, yeah. But before we go there, I couldn't resist the temptation, before we zoom into these resilience-seeking practices and how they work, with what outcomes, under what conditions, I couldn't resist the temptation to reflect, just add a couple of reflections on the parallel trajectories of sustainability, urban sustainability and urban resilience. Depending on your age, you might have a sense of déjà vu in the way in which we are talking about urban resilience. Because although I completely agree with Timon that resilience and sustainability shouldn't be conflated, somehow the way in which they have traveled as notions, very complex notions from scientific debates, very, very fast to become implemented and to become seen as something that should be operationalized and should guide urban planning in policy-making circles, is quite similar. It has many similarities. Because we know the story or the trajectory of urban sustainability, perhaps this can help us to have some insights into some of the issues or problems that we could avoid in relation to the actual implementation of urban resilience. So the first parallel will be that, if you remember, back in the 90s, I don't think that there was any conference that didn't endorse this line, that the fact that the sustainability battle at the time will be won or lost in cities. And this is, of course, with less reference to climate change, but with a very strong reference to the fact that we were living even then in a fast urbanizing world. Now, the question now perhaps is to ask ourselves whether now we are saying that the resilience battle will also be won or lost in cities. I think that that's very much part and a very similar argument that we are witnessing. There are, of course, fantastic achievements of the framing of the challenges we face in terms of resilience. And one of those has been very eloquently put forward and explained by Timon, and has to do with the articulation, again, of a perhaps much more stronger environmental perspective into urban planning, into the way we think, we understand, and we try to act upon cities. This is not a minor thing, because really, I mean, an environmental perspective, if we know about how urban planning works, has been typically quite marginal, to the way we have operated. So this is something that urban sustainability started to do, and resilience is doing at a much faster pace. Most importantly as well, with this re-understanding of the city comes the understanding as well that, of course, cities are not just the physical environment of what we can call a city, but cities expand through their complex metabolism, through very, in some cases, distant relationships, impacts, and so on. So we need to think beyond city boundaries to change how cities work. I mentioned before an unprecedented expanded dialogue across urban science and policy making, and this is no doubt because of the malleability of the notion of urban resilience. The fact there are many scholars now that are starting to talk about urban resilience as a boundary object. And boundary objects have two properties. On the one hand, if you wish, they're quite malleable. They're flexible enough to travel to different domains, yet still they have a core. They are robust enough so that as they travel through different sites or domains, be that policy making, climate change science, disaster risk reduction, and so on, they still keep some consistent meaning. And so this is something that we can also say we are witnessing as an attribute or a quality of urban resilience. However, I thought that it was perhaps pertinent to think about an excellent piece that Michael Radcliffe wrote back in 2006. I can't remember the exact title of his article, but it was something like Sustainable Development, Another Oxymoron Leaves the Scene. An oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, which apparently work together. And we do have to look into this, because it is not by chance that just at the time urban sustainability somehow left the scene, the international scene, in terms of being a cohesive, sexy, attractive vision in the way in which cities should be moving forward, urban resilience came to replace that. We do, of course, run the possibility that in a few years we might be saying goodbye to another oxymoron. And this is why a re-engagement with and a deeper engagement with what we mean by building urban resilience is urgently needed. Am I doing? No? Time on any? No, the other way. What am I doing? Yeah? Okay, fantastic. So, just before we go into Lima and we go into this molecular structure of practices, just worth examining some of those convergences, epistemological convergences and divergences in the way in which we talk about urban resilience. There is a fantastic article by Sarah Miro and colleagues from the University of Michigan that I would recommend you to read, that does a very good job at dissecting, how we talk about urban resilience, what are the different tensions, and so on. And they came up with 6 quite important tensions in the way in which urban resilience is talked about. I'm not going to talk about them all because we don't have much time, but I just want to make reference to 3 of them, which are, in my view, particularly important. One has to do with the pathways to resilience, and this is something that Timon already mentioned. We do tend to talk about urban resilience as a pathway of change that might be trying to advocate the persistence of the robustness of systems to withstand change and disturbances, the transition, some form of gradual change, or in less cases, the transformation. However, when we look at the work of, say, colleagues like even Mark Pelling, who had been advocating a shift towards transformative resilience, we have to acknowledge that what we mean by transformative resilience is still quite ill-defined. What are we talking about? What does it mean? How would we recognize what amounts to transformation and what does not? So there is quite a lot of work required there. A second important dimension that I will come back to is that one of time scales of action. So what we can see is that there is if you wish, some versus or some distinction between a lot of work advocating a focus on rapid onset disturbances, particularly in the case of intensive disaster events, or slow onset changes, and this is something that clearly debates or climate change perspectives have brought much more to the table. However, we are not engaging with risk accumulation from other sources. When we talk about slow onset changes, we are not talking about the very slow, gradual, what I call risk traps, risk accumulation cycles that are formed in cities because of the lack and very insufficient access to water, sanitation, food security, etc., etc. Very basic bills that amplify and get amplified and exacerbated by climate change. A word of reminding on the fact that practicing urban resilience could be seen as wording, as a way of wording. And Ananya Roy and Ong reminds us that wording is, in this case, could be seen as resilience making as a project that instantiates a desirable visual of the word information. And this is something that comes really strongly. We need alternative futures. We need a vision. This is something that the resilience literature, the resilience discourse and narrative has emphasized significantly. However, look at the top pie chart there. It's interesting to see that almost inevitably, and with very few exceptions, resilience is portrayed, and urban resilience is portrayed as a positive, as a positive pathways, when that might, as again Timon reminds us, might not always be the way. What happens, for instance, when we are, in fact, working towards the persistence of very undesirable conditions that have become very resilient in cities. So, of course, we have to interrogate this very positive picture that resilience often presents. Well, that I'm not having much luck. That, yeah. And I thought that if you think about the way in which resilience is presented very much as a normative notion. This is a framework for action. This is the framework for action, the way we should go about, the type of change we require. Most normative frameworks to be kept on their toes need some form of counter-normative narrative. And my choice would be to use socio-environmental justice as a way of interrogate. What are we missing? What do we need to explore deeper? What are we excluding in the way in which we go about urban resilience? In that sense, when I bring a justice perspective, I'm not just talking only about the usual consideration of distribution. Okay, who is benefiting, who is not, who is losing, and so on. That's an important consideration in any assessment of resilience-seeking strategies, but it's not enough. I find it quite useful to borrow on the work of Nancy Fraser and the fact that she really helped us decades ago, more in relation to the notion of social justice, to see that justice is a much more complex concept that has at least 3 dimensions that are very interpenetrated. If one is distribution, a second one is recognition. And what, in a nutshell, Nancy Fraser used to say was, in fact, if you are at the end of maldistribution, it's probably because you are mal or misrecognized. And this is something that sticks quite strongly. So misrecognition and maldistribution are 2 sides of the same coin, if you wish. The third condition or dimension that I'm going to use for the analysis has to do not with the notion of participation, the participation of multiple stakeholders and so on, which somehow is a bit flat in terms of the power relations, the voices, the entitlements that people and different sectors really have to have a say in the way in which we are seeking change in cities, but much more on the notion of parity of participation. This invites us to think about precisely those tensions, those power dynamics, who is included and who is excluded, whose knowledge counts and whose doesn't. I learn now. So now into Lima. How am I doing? This image is an image that overlays four different characters. Many years ago, 2012, one of the first visits, moments in which I started to work on the ground, particularly in the periphery of the city. I don't know how many of you have been or know Lima, but again, this will be very similar to many other contexts, perhaps less desertic, but very similar. What we are looking at here is a context that doesn't look very urban, but it's actually, this is the locus of urbanization. This is the locus of what I call in previous work, peri-urbanization. Because the transition, the urban transition that we are talking at doesn't look like New York. The urban transition that we are talking about will mostly happen across the so-called urban global south, but will not happen necessarily in cities, but in peri-urbanizing contexts. And this is quite important because these peri-urbanizing contexts look quite different, are quite differently populated or equipped in terms of data, in terms of planning mechanisms, entitlements, and so on. If we go to Lima, this is a typical scenario where the actual change and growth is happening. Yeah, this is a periphery where people are being squeezed out of housing and land markets and have no options but to somehow keep occupying in an endless process of vertical urbanization the very steep slopes of the hills that surround the periphery of the metropolitan area. Once I was there, I was saying back in 2012, and we were trying to understand how is that people go about these processes, why, with what consequences, with what cost, with what practices. And one of the community leaders told me, actually, if you look around, you will see that this territory is made out of the practices of four people, yeah? 4 different characters. The old settler, like him, the newcomer, the tourist, and the corrupt. And again, people have this fantastic way sometimes of just, giving a summary to something that you have been trying to articulate for years. And I found that way of describing, again, what is a meaningful way of seeing at how cities, how urbanization in risk is happening, not just in Lima, but elsewhere through this characterization. So what we see here from the extreme right is the image of the old settler. The old settler in this case came in the 90s and invaded the land in collective and community invasions, which were somehow sanctioned, yeah, also by the state as a state policy. Over time, these groups have been able to somehow, through a huge amount of resilience-seeking practices, many of those collective, somehow managed to produce a dwelling, a collective dwelling, which is inhabitable, yeah? Which is very resilient as well. It's resilient to droughts, it's resilient to mudslides, it's resilient to rock slides, it's resilient to gastrointestinal and respiratory diseases, to fires, because they are very, very poor electricity connections, and so on. So we can see a whole universe of risk and hazards here, against which people have to work on a daily basis. Now, next to it, we have the newcomer. The newcomer is someone that has arrived in the last 5 years and somehow has been able to settle above the old comers. And how the newcomer has come to this land is completely different. Yeah? The newcomers keep on coming in masses. I go once or twice to Lima and to the same areas, and just like the boundary of the city keeps on expanding up and up and up and up in an endless way. And the newcomer typically has to buy a plot, and he or she might buy it either from the old settler, from community groups that are doing some pirate subdivision, or through mafias, land traffic mafias, which operate at a scale and are configuring the whole belt of that configures the periphery, the urban interface of Lima, an area where over a third of the city's population live. Now, the tourist is very interesting. The tourist is someone that is also probably from the area, but has perhaps just bought a plot as a survival capitalization structure. Yeah, so, you know, like we invest that, I try to capture and, you know, put a shack there and slowly start the whole process of reverse urbanization that characterizes these areas, in the hope that either I will be able to sell that or to pass it to my son or to my daughter. Yeah, it's somehow a backup. Let me just go again. Sorry about that. Yeah. Now, when we started working there, one of the first things was obviously the need to make these territories and these processes visible. And although, you know, I mean, Lima is not at all a data-poor city in comparison to most cities, in comparison to most medium-sized cities and towns, we found that when we went to the municipal district and to the metropolitan municipality, that the aerial photos of the periphery were blank. There was nobody there. Having been in the field, that didn't make any sense. So one of the processes that we have to start was even, we have to start from zero, using drones with the communities to even have a basis that allow us to record and compare the pace of expansion. So this just records different stages into something that we call eventually remap risk, which we have applied to other cities, which is trying to connect, as Timon was saying, the use of technology, the use of very simple technologies, in this case mobile phones, to produce community-led data, and to make that data and information travel in the reframing of how the discussions on resilience are taking place. I'm not going to say much about this process. That, of course, allow us to, again, set up the boundaries, understand how fast they were growing, what were the boundaries where the communities subdividing plots and organized land mafia traffickers were clashing, with what consequences, what were doing in those clashes, how was the municipality playing a role into all that through practice of clientelism, but also of corruption, etc., etc. Now, it was interesting to see, this is at a certain point we decided that it was useful to make an exhibition with all these artifacts produced by the people, and also the voices of what happened through the process. And what one of the residents from one of the settlements where we work is saying here is, we turned to worry about the settlement, but we were not always aware of what was happening on our back. Yeah? On the back of the agrupaciones, on the back of the community organizations. With the drones, with this way of mapping, we were able to see how much land traffickers are moving ahead. I'm bringing this quote here because it's quite important, as much as I advocate the importance of swimming and diving into the molecular structure of resilience-seeking practices. We also obviously need to understand and look back at the bigger picture of these practices. And this is precisely what this community leader is doing here in her statement. She's saying, actually, we tended to look at the universe and seek resilience within the universe of a settlement, thinking, how do we get water, how do we get sanitation, how do we get land tenure security, and so on, and we were ignoring a process that was undermining a lot of what we are doing, which is exactly continuous to ours. This is true for many other processes across the city. I'm not, again, going to stop, but much of this mapping allows us to compare things over time, to look at different levels and drivers of vulnerability, overlay different conditions that make people vulnerable, but also their capacities to act. And one interesting thing was a comparison, again, between the old settlers and the newcomers, and what were their conditions, and clearly they were hugely contrasting conditions. To interrogate that point even further, what we found very interesting was to contrast the timelines, the timelines of resilience-seeking practices when you deploy them over time. And I think that this is something quite important to do for cities as a whole. If we were to look at how resilience has been sought through different practices in a neighborhood, in a settlement, in a whole city, in a set of or networks of cities, and we were to put money to that, something that we did as well. We thought, let's quantify, let's look at how much people in the municipality, land traffickers, how much everybody is investing and with what consequences. What we found in those two lines, the blue line shows the timeline of resilient-seeking practices and investments of one of the settlements at the bottom part of the slope. So obviously some degree of consolidation, cost and investments being kept quite regularly, and a level by which we can see a gradual transition and consolidation by which eventually these areas are becoming more habitable. Now if we look at the situation of the newcomers, and again this is not only true for Lima, I have done this same exercise in many other cities, we will find that newcomers, those coming in the last 5 to 10 years, have no chance of succeeding by replicating the same resilience-seeking practices. So what we can see there, again, is how the cost required to do the same at the top of the steep slopes is growing exponentially. And this has significantly to do with the fact that resilience-seeking strategies practiced from below by the old settler and from above by the land traffickers are externalizing, are displacing cost, effects, and impacts to this middle ground of the newcomer. That means, in effect, that although people come to the area and say, well, actually, I couldn't do it anywhere else in the city, with 150 pounds, which is a huge amount of money, but is somehow doable, I can buy a plot. Buying a plot means just buying the demarcation on the slope, on the slope. Now, what people don't realize is that once you have bought that plot, they expect that they will be able to reproduce the same process of urbanization that the old settler has produced over typically 3 years, with a level of investments of about 1,000 pounds, etc., etc. What we found is that for the newcomer, the bill is much larger. People need, from the point of flattening the plot, bringing some form of very basic systems to store water, electricity connections, and so on. So very, very, very basic conditions, retaining walls to stop rock slides and so on, require an average investment of 10,000 pounds on top of the 150 pounds. So if you think that on average, and many people are below there, on average, the house, the saving capacity of a household in this area and across the poor settlements, low-income settlements in Lima comes to 350 pounds. That means that in effect, the newcomers at scale need a whole life to achieve very, very basic and efficient conditions. So we cannot at all overlook those practices and those investments. We did also, of course, look and interrogate it, and how is that the state is investing money? How is that aligned with the resilience agenda, and also with what outcomes? Again, a long story here, but to make it simple, we will see the top pie shows the budget allocations over the last, 2010-2015 of Metropolitan Lima, the municipality of Metropolitan Lima. Below that is one at the district level, the district of San Juan del Lurigancho, which is the poorest district where many of the settlements that I showed before are. And what we will find is that although many of these investments on the territory were made on the name of resilience, look at what was the biggest area, gray there and green here, roads and transport infrastructure. Most of the money goes into, the usual business of expanding roads and infrastructure. Interesting as well to see that when we were to look at those particular areas where we were working and try to see what money was the state investing and where, the money invested there was also very connected with open or improving accessibility. Improving accessibility meant opening the door for more newcomers, for more land trafficking, and so on. So again, an unwanted and unexpected outcome of a condition and a type of programs that were aimed to improve conditions in the area. We look also in detail at programs that were quite pro-poor in nature and very much aligned with the idea of building a new vision for the city, like Barrio Mío, a program that, that ended a few years ago. Now, Barrio Mío was, in short, a program that was saying, okay, we need to acknowledge the need for upgrading in a city like Lima. In a city with the levels of inequality like Lima, upgrading, nothing will change unless we think about upgrading. Now, still and beyond, and despite its pro-poor credentials, when we look at where is that Barrio Mío, a metropolitan municipal initiative of large scale, aiming to target the habitat of the poor, aiming to improve and upgrade and support the resilient makings of the poor, landed on the ground where it materialized those investments, we will see that actually when it came to many of those fingers, which are some of the slope areas that I showed you before, actually the money again came mostly to build ladders, more accessibility, again, some of the main elements that were propelling the commodification of the slopes, and nothing else. When we ask them, but why nothing else? Why no sanitation? Why not, why the bills on many other issues are clearly extraordinarily needed? And they say, well, actually, the problem here is that we cannot invest in areas that don't have land titles, that are not, clearly entitled, because otherwise we are giving the wrong message and people will keep on settling here endlessly. You might have heard this in city after city after city. We cannot intervene in areas that have a high degree of informal land tenure insecurity, because otherwise more people will come, like if people came there because it's fun. This is quite important because this means that very often, even in the most progressive attempts to intervene in the city, we bypass or exclude the bulk of those that need support in the resilient seeking strategies. I have very few minutes, so I'm going to speed. An interesting contrast in terms of maps and initiatives. If we look at the resilience agenda in a city like Lima, again, like many other cities across not only Latin America, but also Asia and Africa, we will find that the resilience agenda has been articulated on the name of risk, less reduced risk. In this case, of course, again, Lima has everything, from tsunamis to the very extensive risks that I mentioned before, or on the name of green infrastructure. And again, in the case of Lima, we can see a very rich ecological infrastructure, which is vital. The areas that I showed you before coincide with a very delicate ecosystem called lomas costeras. And these lomas costeras are seasonal, but they appear in certain seasons, and they are basically vegetable coverage that allows and enhances the recharge of the aquifers and also the management of microclimate conditions. So imagine in a desert city like Lima how important those lomas costeras are. Now, the city of Lima, the Metropolitan Authority, decided a few years ago not only to map in detail that rich ecological infrastructure, but also to do something about that. And they enacted a very interesting plan to protect the lomas costeras. Now, when we look at the lomas costeras, there was a very interesting process of extraction and abstraction. And I think that this is an issue that we usually see in many resilience-seeking efforts. The extraction of some elements or systems within the city which are too complex politically and socially to deal with, and the abstraction from the territory. So in this case, what we found was that instead of covering the whole system of lomas costeras, the municipality ended with a series of green parks on some of the lomas costeras. And when we say, but why not the others? Why not the more critical ones that are on areas of high risk, informal settlement and so on? They say, well, because the land conflicts there are, make those areas untouchable. We cannot intervene on those areas. So actually, we can only intervene on areas where we have some hold over the land, some control over the land. Therefore, again, what we have in the end were a set of islands of reform. And this is something that happens again and again and again, and that we need to watch. Because if we start with a systems perspective, which is vital for understanding how the city needs to change and is changing, but we end with interventions that just do little bits of greening, we are quite likely to end with process of unwanted commodification, gentrification, displacement, and so on. Although I focus on Lima, the story and the stories and the narratives about these molecular resilience-seeking practices are applicable to many, many other cities, and also are applicable to what governments are doing on the name of resilience. I'm just highlighting here, another key narrative that is very much articulated to that of seeking resilience by governments, which has to do with the idea of somehow curbing informal growth, controlling informal growth, the narrative that we saw clearly in the case of Lima, but also in Mexico DF, and green infrastructure protection. Many years ago, I had the chance to work in Milpalta, one of the most rural, and I think that the last district to be annexed to Mexico DF, because precisely, because of its valuable land and the capacity of this land, forested land, in acting as performing the function of securing the aquifers recharge, which are central for the provision of water in Mexico City. Now, again, it's very interesting. I wrote an article on this, but it's very interesting to see how the narrative of curbing informal growth has been replaced, and the idea of zero growth pacts as a way to do that, a participatory but coercive way, resilience-seeking strategy, has been in recent years replaced by the idea of implementing a payment for environmental and hydrological services program, which is one of the largest in the whole of Latin America, on the name of the protection of green infrastructure. None of them had worked, and we could discuss why if we have time in the debate. Although I have insisted, I'm going to finish then, although I have insisted on the importance of looking at these very grounded molecular resilience-seeking practices, I'm not saying that we should romanticize what happens on the ground. I'm saying that we need to learn from what the processes that actually build cities and already seek resilience, with positive or not positive outcomes. Somewhere that I had the pleasure of doing a few years ago in Coral, in the city of Dhaka, Bangladesh, was precisely trying to understand the built-in resilience strategies and practices. So those that are translated actually even in the way people go about building, in very low-lying areas where most of the poor, no surprise again, live in the city of Dhaka. So, of course, we found plenty of practices that are extraordinarily clever, that are nature-based, in a way, are peoples-based, nature-based. I don't know how to call them, but they're very clever. They make a lot of sense. The materials, how climate is understood, how the different changes that one could expect over the season, from the rainy season to the dry season and so on, need different coping mechanisms and so on. But what we did there was something else. We look at not only the description and the documentation of those built-in resilience practices, but we look at two contrasting scenarios. We look at Coral and Mohammadpur. These two are two settlements, 40 years. They have been, two informal settlements, have been there for over 40 years with very similar biophysical conditions, but one big difference. In Mohammadpur, the land is private. So people build these palafied structures, every 6 months, because land tenure security and the horizon to plan is only of 6 months. In Coral, the land is public, and although people have gone through several evictions and attempt of evictions, they have been able to resist them, and they have acquired some de facto land tenure security. What we found, in fact, most of these practices were present in Coral, but not in Mohammadpur. In Mohammadpur, there was no maturation of the resilience-seeking practices. And this is a very important process, because the lesson from this is that resilience-seeking practices can only mature under certain conditions, conditions that recognize or give some degree of entitlement to poor women and men and their collectives. I'm almost finishing, yeah. I think I'm on the last one. So clearly, if we go back to this idea of the molecular and multiple resilience-seeking practices, I'm not by any means saying that the only resilience-seeking practices are those of the urban poor, but neither should we think that are those of the state or, you know, or at different scales with the support or external support agencies and some, you know, steering of participation or multi-stakeholder workshops. What we need to move beyond the rhetoric of collaborative governance and so on is to really start by doing very, very detailed maps of what are the multiple practices that are coexisting in a given territory. This is what I try to do here. Yeah, just trying to understand. This was in the case of Lima, but again, could be done, and I have done this to many other cities. This wheel is trying to show, on the one hand, what are the institutional practices that are seeking resilience in this case, and what are the everyday practices. And also trying to understand which ones are based on cooperation and which ones are based on individual, on competition, on individual action, on sometimes on individualizing practices. Having those maps shows us that in many cases, and paradoxically, many of these resilience seekings are undermining each other. And this is certainly what we found in Lima, but in applying a similar approach in cities like Freetown, Karonga, and many other cities that we analyze through another project called Urban Arc. So if we go back to this idea that we need to move from participation to parity of participation, that means, first of all, identifying and mapping these practices with critical lenses. Yeah? Nothing is to be romanticized here. Some things might be, again, well-intended, but not necessarily, you know, have desirable consequences. And we need to think about how, from these very complex maps of already existing resilience-seeking practices, we carve political space for more transformative conditions. In some cases, the problem, as I said before, is not so much that the knowledge, the know-how, and the practices are not there, but they are not enabled, they are not activated, they are eroded or undermined by the lack of entitlements. So this is very much the foundation from which we need to start. To conclude, because I think I am over time, I suppose I'm saying that resilience seeking needs to be framed as a relational practice. Yeah? And this again means more than multidisciplinarity, multi-stakeholder involvement, and so on. We need to understand the politics of those relations, because many of those relations, like with urban sustainability in the past, undermine each other. Many of those relations have a hierarchical or subordinated relation, yeah, between each other. So we cannot take this as if societies and territories were flat, yeah, in terms of their power relations, their capacities to act, and so on. I leave it here, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for offering this complementary perspective to the Timon talk. I would invite you both now on the stage here, and we'll open the floor for the debate. We have almost half an hour for the debate, so enough time, and I wouldn't comment on risk accumulation and the transformative pattern that need to be framed in order to tackle this relationship between sustainability and resilience, but just there are two persons with the microphones just around, so just please, who wants to intervene, just stand up And please say your name, your affiliation, and then questions welcome. Anybody? I could start asking questions for hours. Please, Gonzalo.
Thank you. Good morning.
No, okay, it's fine.
Always difficult to be the first one, huh? I'm Fred Sanders from Delft University in the Netherlands. It's very nice to see that the problems are the problems of cities and the problems are of the countryside, but how about the problem governments? How is this influencing all these planning and framing? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah? It's a general question, or would you refer to?
Okay. I can start. I think this is a really interesting one and it contrasts, I think, quite a bit with what you were talking about, Adriana. In terms of the different roles in various kinds of resilience practices. So, one of the things we see in particular in, and I guess I'll talk from the U.S. because I know it the best, but you see similar things in some of Europe, is that there's a very strong role by the government in terms of funding particular kinds of resilience practices that are motivated in perhaps very different ways than what might be motivating individual homeowners or individual residents in terms of their kinds of resilience practices. So, for example, in New York City, there wasn't a lot of effort around resilience until we were hit with a major extreme event. And then all of a sudden, it matters. But what mattered was the economic losses. And so when $90 billion were lost to the region, all of a sudden that starts to motivate a different level of investment. And so I think one of the things, I don't know where you're going with this in the question, but one of the things we see is that there's massive potential for investments when investors are motivated in the right way, but then of course it's very top-down, and the kinds of decision-making may or may not be as open and inclusive to other kinds of perspectives or needs. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges we have to get at, is how do we both support practices at the ground level as well as ones that are maybe at the municipal or even regional scale, and how do we harmonize between those two? I'm sure some of you have some examples of where that's happening really well, and those would be interesting to see in terms of how different, from government agencies to these sort of multi-stakeholder input processes, to have more participatory decision-making, how that's maybe happening in some places. But I think that's actually a challenge that we still have.
Perhaps, yes, I agree that it's a very important question, and we were reminded today about the importance of the significant role that local authorities play into all this. With my talk, I wasn't at all intended to undermine that significance and importance. I think that if we were to summarize where is that the role of the local government can do things that others cannot do, let's say. I think that one is definitely in this idea of directing investment, both public and private investments. And local authorities have a huge capacity to do that through planning, regulations, and so on, precisely to decide, how are things going to happen, under what conditions, and so on. We have a lot to learn from, land value capture, and so on. No, we can use many strategies by which we say, actually, yes, you can invest. Certain things, certain developments might happen, but they have to fix positive values. Yeah, they have to fix positive outcomes for other parts of the city, for the collective good. So there are plenty of examples. The second one has to do with the activation of entitlements. Local authorities can, I think that mostly inadvertently, play an unwanted role in terms of rendering invisible a large percentage of their populations. And this is something that has to change. I have worked in many cities over the years, and I don't know, I'm thinking about going to the city of Dar es Salaam and looking at the resilience in terms of, water systems within the city. And what you can see is that, in fact, informal water vendors are the ones that are running the whole city, and that perhaps half of the population in a city like Dar gets water through water vendors, of poor quality, of high cost, of poor regularity. Again, nothing to celebrate there. When we went to local authorities and said, what are you going to do about, what is the plan for water vendors? And they say, no, they shouldn't exist. This is a typical problem. I think that very often what we find in local authorities is this idea of certain parts of realities, the realities that make the cities shouldn't exist. We might agree in principle, but that won't take us very far.
Gonzalo, please.
Yes, Gonzalo Di Serralde, University of Montreal. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. My question is for Adriana. In order to avoid what some people now call maladaptation or secondary effects of resilience and adaptation, is it worth distinguishing in the cases you studied between resilience mechanisms and survival mechanisms? Is it worth, for example, in the case of Lima, making a distinction between what is just survival from what is adaptation and resilience? Thank you.
Sure. Yes, thank you for that question. I thought someone was going to say, well, it's all because you call it resilience. Why to call it resilience, these practices? Someone could even say not just survival, but coping, strategies and so on. I think that they will pass the test. If we look at what will be the conditions that we will ask, the requirements for other strategies, government strategies and so on, to be called as resilience-seeking strategies, in the processes that I have described, we will find exactly the same. These are not just survival. These are, again, these are survival/resilience-seeking strategies. But they have some element of futurity. They anticipate change. They anticipate change and qualify it as undesirable. Rock slides are undesirable. Whatever, water, lack of water further than 100 meters away from the household is undesirable, etc., etc. Certain costs are undesirable. So what is the difference between those calculations that people do on everyday planning and the sort of everyday of formal planning that we see happens in, in municipal offices? I think that there is value in calling them resilience-seeking practices because they are alternative visions. And they are, most importantly, not only the alternative visions, but the visions and the practices that build, by large, the cities, at least of the Global South.
Maybe it's also worth pointing out that that these strategies are, as you mentioned, coping strategies, and that is actually fundamentally, at least, thought of as part of resilience, right? Is that coping capacity is a way in which a lot of times we think about in terms of, say, vulnerability assessment. This is a critical piece that we're trying to evaluate, is what is the coping capacity of different people. And I'll take an example that I didn't talk about today, but a PhD student I'm working with in Sao Paulo in Brazil was looking at landslides and trying to understand from a systems perspective why are some communities much more vulnerable to these very persistent and increased frequency of landslides in the Sao Paulo region. And there you have this whole mix of individuals and neighborhoods that have greater coping capacity, some because of the different building practices that they've put in place, other because of the nature of their social relationships where people can help each other, and then some areas that are more newly established, and at least so far what we're finding is that some of that social cohesion and some of those practices aren't as well based in this, so they're more vulnerable in that sense. But I think I agree with you anyway. I think all of those fit into a concept of resilience and a theory of resilience, and certainly in terms of a set of practices that we might talk of as more or less resilient.
Any other question, comment about that? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Juan Carlos. I'm a student here at UIC at the Master of International Cooperation for Sustainable Emergency Architecture. And I wanted to ask you, you both mentioned about kind of this reframing from sustainability to resiliency and how these kind of concepts were embraced by policy circles, but also about how the process of counter narratives and accepting kind of the negative implications of sustainability came to be by the time when resiliency kind of overcame the narrative. So looking forward, what do you think that we can do to avoid that by the time that the counter narratives to resiliency and the negative effects of this imposition of this different understandings of resiliency come to the policy circles, this is replaced by another concept that can be taken over. So what can we do from the academia, but mostly in the implementation side of things to avoid this?
It's a very easy question to answer.
That's why I'm going to leave it to Adriana. Yes, it's all you.
I think that we have to be, we should be a bit harder with ourselves as an international community that works and thinks and tries to think practically about cities, in the sense that I think that is not enough. Every time, you know, a notion becomes a bit bastardized, we replace it by another sexy one and so on, and we say, forget about urban sustainability, that's the thing of the past. I completely agree with Timon that resilience and sustainability offer very different framings, they're complementary, they're not the same. They shouldn't be conflated, neither should be taken as replacements. What I was trying to warn was perhaps warn ourselves about this tendency to phagocytate very complex terms that comes from science with lots of fantastic work, lots of eye-opening understandings, and sometimes we phagocytate them into a fashion. In the case of resilience, well, it's nicer to talk about resilience than vulnerability. Actually, it sounds far more positive. You know, you can hear why people are engaging, which of course is fine. Of course, you know, terms gain popularity because of that. But I'm not advocating by being critical, let's dump urban resilience. Let's acknowledge what the notion of urban resilience has done for urban planning, for seeking, for understanding how cities work and understanding how they need to change. Let's also acknowledge and not forget what sustainability debates have done for that. But let's keep on pushing. Can we be more aspirational? There was debate earlier about we should be, of course, you know, we definitely need multidisciplinarity and so on. I completely agree, but I think that even with disciplinarity, we have to go beyond multi and inter. We need to be transdisciplinarity. We need to engage with processes that formulate the questions that we're answering. And I'm talking about engaging critically and deeper, not deeping or replacing. So I think that resilience has a lot. As I said before, for me, one of the big conditions is, and something interesting, is to think about it, as I said, as a boundary object, something that can be, you know, can be understood. You can talk about resilience with ordinary citizens, with governments of different nationalities and so on, and everybody gets a sense of what you mean, even with different understandings. Now, is that enough, or can we add value to that? For me, the adding weight to the notion to make sure that it's not co-opted, that it's not abandoned, that it's not replaced in a few years, has to do with doing a more ambitious framing, asking fundamental questions. Let's not say just there are trade-offs, there are tensions, there are win-win. We know that. That's what we said about sustainability. What are those tensions? How are we going to go about that? What are the versus? Are we not forgetting some of the versus that we should be discussing? Particularly those that have to do with the governance of resilience? Probably yes. So I would say we are in a good place, but moving forward in terms of implementation means asking more difficult questions. We are always, I suppose, challenged with the fact of what do we do when faced with complexity. So we can reduce complexity to make it manageable, but that's not the trick. The trick is to manage complexity in its full complexity.
I think you answered that really well for a really tough question.
Okay.
I mean, maybe just to add to that, that this effort to try to manage the complexity is perhaps the place where we really have to dig in. And echoing what you said already, I think both concepts have a lot of utility. I don't think we're going to lose that utility all of a sudden in the next 5 years. But it's digging into those trade-offs in a way that we can understand them. Like, we know they exist, right? But in practice, on the ground, in a particular community, that's exactly where we need to sort of understand how do we minimize some of those particular trade-offs. And then again, as you said, how do we start to manage the system in a way? And to me, I guess fundamentally, two concepts are really important. One is to bring in the system's perspective to actually make that complexity not something that's sort of out here as an idea, but to recognize that that is the reality that we live in, the people live in, and that they're responding to constantly every day. And then to also bring sort of this overlapping, we were talking about this earlier this morning, there's all these overlapping concepts from adaptation and resilience, which overlap very strongly, transformation, which sort of cuts across sustainability and resilience. And I think all that's okay. we need to deal with all of those. It's fine. We need to bring transformational thinking into this. But ultimately, we need to recognize that that complexity that is actually driving particular patterns, like persistent social inequalities, is the only way we're going to be able to solve some of those problems that come into resilience thinking too, is to dig into that complexity, understand where those levers of change are, and try to affect them.
Alessandra, please. Sí, Rita.
Hi, my name is Alessandra. I'm from University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I am very interested in something in a slide that was shown before about trajectories of resilience and sustainability. So like, how do we make the jump from like a path to a different path? How we take advantage of different degrees of resilience within the path we are at. There is something that is very interesting in the idea of a transformative change that, you know, bring us to higher sustainability. But that's also a very, I mean, I would like to comment you on that, because transformative change implies a degree of very strong uncertainty. When you make an important transformative change in a system, you don't know exactly who's going to be the winner and the loser of the transformation. And also, you have to be really confident that your goals are the right ones. 100 years ago, we designed cities. We knocked down half of the fabrics of cities because we thought that was wrong. We wanted to make an important transformative change, and we end up in a situation that is much worse. So how do you reconcile the idea of transformative change with the uncertainty that that change brings? And, you know.
Thanks, Alessandra. May I suggest, since it's just, we have just 5 more minutes, and I saw lots of hands, may we take a couple of questions, just the last round of questions, and then we try to give some answers. Hummels.
Yeah, this is Benjamin. Hello from RWTH Aachen. I just want to ask if we, what do you think about reframing the word natural disaster as well?
Reframing?
I could elaborate on that, but I think keep it short is enough.
Yeah. Okay. And yes.
Hello, this is Anna from the Center of Development Research from the Bonn University. And I'm very glad that Adriana talked about transdisciplinarity. So, but this question is for both. How to talk to politicians and policymakers to get them engaged in resilience and sustainable initiatives that will go beyond the period they are in power. Thank you.
Okay. One last question, otherwise. Yeah? Okay, no, sorry. You're welcome.
Maybe I'll start and you can have the last word. Yeah? This question on uncertainty, I think, is a really important one, right? What's not very well conveyed in some of these various projections we put up is that they're very uncertain, right? So pretty much everything about the future is uncertain. That's the nature of the future in many ways. I don't think there is any fundamental silver bullet solution to making transformations and not knowing exactly what the outcomes are going to be. I think that's true with pretty much any decision. So at some level, this is just sort of back to reality and saying, this is the reality of what we're dealing with, that we don't exactly know what some of the unintended consequences might be of certain kinds of actions. And so there's no way to make transformations that are going to be perfect. I don't believe that's actually true. I think it's all experimental, right? There's a recent paper that was sort of talking about the fact that a lot of what we're doing is tinkering with systems and kind of playing around and seeing what's happened. On the other hand, we can learn from past mistakes, and we can learn and at least develop some strategies. And I think one of the important things about this kind of conference and about this sort of coming together of different perspectives is to share best practices, to share things that we've learned from global south context and global north context, to see what might actually make sense to apply. And then again, it's still going to be an experiment no matter what we do there. On the other hand, I think there's windows of opportunity that come and go, and so it's also to capitalize on those moments. And so some of these sort of efforts where, say, resilience might be reduced, there's very short windows of opportunity to do something transformative. And I guess coming back to sort of this uncertainty question is, we shouldn't be too fearful of making change because it's happening anyway. So when there's a window of opportunity, we've got to take advantage of that and go for it. I think this is the kind of thing that's happening when these disasters hit, is there's opportunities to do things differently. And in some cases, in New York, we didn't take advantage of that. You know, we haven't really realized that we're going to have to retreat from some of the coastal areas that we're in, because in this case we have resources to sort of ignore that and build up again in some of the same locations. And so building differently and retrofitting our cities is going to be really crucial, but also to take advantage of those windows of opportunity when they happen. And just quickly, and I'll hand it over to Adriana, on the reframing natural disasters, I sort of use that language because I think in the end, many of us would agree they're not strictly natural disasters. People have been discussing this for a while. They're socio-ecological disasters, or they're even just straight up human disasters. And that's why I was talking earlier about this concentration. The nature of the urban enterprise is that the way in which we're bringing people into high density areas and concentrating really sensitive or expensive infrastructure means that we're setting up disasters in a way. So really understanding the human role and the decision that we have in the way in which we're creating vulnerabilities and creating risk is, one, important to surface and for us to be clear about, but then that also allows us, when we have that clarity to understand what are the kinds of practices that need to be put in place so we can reduce that risk.
Okay. In the reverse order from the first question, how do we talk to politicians about resilience and keep their engagement? I think that, I mean, again, I agree, completely agree with Timon about being very clever and strategic about using windows of opportunity. But windows of opportunity are something that we don't have to sit and wait for. We have to open. And this is what I meant in the slide that is still there about carving the political space. When you carve the political space, it means you create windows of opportunity. And very often you do that by reframing a conversation. Are we talking about, I don't know, recovering from the last flood, or are we talking about what do we do to live a resiliency? You know, it's just that reframing that somehow from an event that might seem to be localized, affecting a particular group, sector of the economy, and so on, you bring a conversation to show the relevance of doing something about that at the wide level of the city. And there are many clever ways. I was thinking about like something very interesting that, for instance, people did in Caracas many years ago, was the use of mobile cabinets. The idea that instead of discussing issues of the city, you know, in the town hall, you should have, you know, just somehow visits, field visits. You should have the cabinet, the municipal cabinets, traveling to different parts of the city and talking in situ about what's happening and so on. That has an enormous value, the lived experience of what is happening, the exchange between, you know, what I assume you're doing and when you tell me why are you doing that, under what conditions and so on, creates solidarity, creates an understanding. So I think that those are, you know, really leaving the office is quite essential. The second question of reframing natural disasters, I think that there has been a long debate on that, on the idea that, you know, back in the 70s already, we had a big line of thought saying, actually, what we call disasters and natural disasters are completely socially constructed. Same goes for climate change. We don't mean they don't exist. Yeah, they do exist very much, but they are driven by human action. So the same is true with resilience. But I think that it's probably important not to leave anything as an act of God. So when we naturalize, we could be normalizing parts of the realities and then stepping away from taking responsibility for change. So it's quite important perhaps to keep that terminology. So thanks for that. The last one on transformative change. For me, as I said before, if I try, and there is no single formula, so what matters is the questions you ask. When you are in front of a plan, you ask a number of questions. And for me, those questions usually have to do with trying to understand what's the redistribution scheme, you know, that is going to, what type of redistribution is going to happen with this intervention, who is recognized and who is not, who is included and not excluded, and who is also embedded and enabled and activated in terms of entitlements to be part of this, which doesn't mean to be part by putting labor and, you know, it's not about the self-help building of the city. Yeah? We're talking about the democratic engagement. So those three elements of justice, of socio-environmental justice, and how they are framed, I suppose the key question when it comes to resilience is, we could say, well, is transformative change one in which we see resilience as a precondition for socio-environmental justice, or the other way around? For me, it's the other way around. So it's quite important to take it's not we replace, yeah? But what we decide, what are we saying? First we achieve resilience, and then we think about, okay, what do we do with the rest, you know, with inequality and so on, power relations, asymmetric, you know, relations and so on, or is it the other way around? Or is it almost simultaneously, yeah? This subordination of what we think is the next or the most urgent job is quite important. The same happened with sustainability. In the end, we ended with rhetoric where, in practice, a lot of the urban sustainability in practice was resourcing to, okay, sustaining economic growth in cities as a precondition for them doing some form of transformation socially and environmentally. The old stuff. This is what we have been saying for decades in urban planning. First we grow, we have the resources, then we redistribute a bit, then we look at, you know, the environmental mess and see. Of course, we cannot afford to do that, neither with the environmental bill or the social bill.
Thank you so much. We really need to close now the session. Thank you so much. I guess this is the first time in a conference in which we don't start with celebration of resilience and then end up the conference saying maybe we should be careful about that, but we really stayed opening that resilience should be carefully reconsidered and make room for this transformative change and political space, right? So we won't hide the keynotes. They will be available here to the coffee break, so please just interact. And since the networking is key, we have almost half an hour now. Just take in mind the complexity of this building. And so you've been entering from back, but now the coffee break is here in front. So just go through that door, and the bathroom are there. But then the one room is up. And, I mean, you can ask all the assistants. Yeah, there will be 30 people assisting you, and during the coffee break you can ask questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah.